Hello and welcome back to the Justified Belief podcast. It's been a while, but we're back. End of the year usually gets hectic. I've been wanting to do this episode for a very long time, and we are here finally. So I recommend, before you hear this one, that you actually check out the episode titled Urudu Genesis, the Sumerian creation story. I did it a really long time ago. It'll give you a quick foundation about what I'm getting into today, and add some details that I just can't drop into this episode just because of the amount of time it would take. And that's why I broke them up in the first place. I urge anyone who's listening, especially non-believers, to just hear me out and listen with an open mind. The reason I'm making this episode is to debunk and remove the stumbling block of the Annunaki or the Anunnaki ancient aliens thing, right? That's permeated our mainstream culture and run rampant, sadly, with baseless theories and speculative translations of Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts. And that's something we're going to get into right now. So just a fast answer, like, are the Annunaki real? Yes, they were real. Is there any proof that they were ancient alien astronauts that seeded the earth? No, there's not. And that's the highlight of the episode. So those who are still interested in the details, we're going to jump right into it. So the Annunaki were originally a pantheon of ancient gods in Sumerian and Mesopotamian times. Each one was created as a deity for its own city-state within ancient Sumer. There are actual figurines, text stories, and descriptions of these various deities found throughout Mesopotamia. It's no secret they're talked about, known, documented, and identified. But nowhere in Sumerian text or depictions were they ever believed to be an ancient, advanced alien astronaut race from another planet. In this case, the planet was called Nibiru, which, spoiler alert, does not exist. And there is no mention of it in Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts unless you have a quote-unquote special translation of the text and use some translational trickery. The very first time that the Annunaki are mentioned as alien astronauts is in 1976 by the author of a book called 12th Planet, that author being a guy named Zecharia Sitchin. This is where the theory came from, and it excited the minds of many. So Sitchin claims to build on this view of the Annunaki building the human race and making Adam and Eve to populate the earth as slave labor for the gods. Sitchin claims he reinterpreted or retranslated cuneiform tablets and Mesopotamian texts to discover this ancient secret. On a sidebar note, it takes many years of work, schooling, dedication to be able to correctly decipher these texts. Sitchin never had a formal education in the field of Assyriology, Sumerology, or any other comparative Near Eastern language. He actually made the self-claim of being an ancient scholar of Sumerian. His degree was actually in economics, and it definitely paid off because I'm sure he made a decent bit of money peddling this theory and with his books, which 12th Planet is actually the first book in a series that he wrote about these ancient aliens of Sumer. Now, sometimes, on different podcasts, different, whatever your media outlet is, you always hear people say, oh, the scholars, right? The scholars of today, and I've done it too. It's just easier to say the scholars, and just use it as a blanket term. But in this case, there is a long list of scholars who are actually learned, in Akkadian, ancient Sumerian culture, mythology, and that whole deal. So just a few notable scholars discredit what Sitchin writes about. Are a gentleman named Michael Heiser, PhD in Hebrew, Bible, and ancient Semitic languages. He actually said that Sitchin's translations violate basic philology and fabricate meanings not supported by the text, and further argues Sitchin's translations are systematically flawed, says he has yet to find a line of cuneiform text supporting Sitchin's claims, i.e. like the Annunaki being ancient aliens from the planet Nibiru. Another scholar, William Halo, a Syriologist, says Sitchin's work is error-ridden and not very helpful for understanding the ancient world. And then finally, another gentleman, scholar, Samuel Kramer, he's a pioneer in Assyriology. He's considered an expert in Sumerian history and language. His work is considered foundational for the field, and he is the scholarly baseline for this field. And Sitchin's work just completely diverges from his, and both in methodology, but also in translational accuracy. So sadly, in the 12th Planet, just like, many other books of its type, Sitchin's just completely annihilates biblical context and direct quotes, and just gives half-truths and partial context to say that the Bible ties into his theory. Mostly pointing to things like the reason for the flood, the story of Noah, and of course everyone's favorite ancient biblical characters of mystery, the Nephilim. So Sitchin's completely deviated from long-established translations that have been affirmed inaccuracy by actual scholars who specialize in the field, some of the guys I named. Now, the 12th Planet book is like 700 pages, so I can't share all my notes and in-text examples, but I'm going to give you a few examples from his book that I just thought were the most egregious, for lack of a better word, just to show you guys, what some people ascribe to. But even just as someone who, and again, all sorts of people will say, well, whatever, I got a Christian bias, this, that, and the other. But as I tell you guys all the time who listen to my podcast, you be the judge. I really try to approach everything objectively. I've just slid in deeper into Christendom because the more I started reading some of these like so-called, biblical parallels, some of these, ancient religions and things like this, like the Nephilim aliens from outer space, it does not hold a candle to biblical history, and that's something we're going to get into later. Even just from just an objective viewpoint, just the very fact of his education and background already disqualifies him to translate a single line of text from one of these slates. But anyway, I digress. So jumping back in here, Sitchin's and others like him just completely twist and establish biblical history, context, and writings to justify nonsensical doctrine. And like with most things that try to discredit the Bible, the first thing done is to use the Bible as the anchor point and then proceed to say that all translations, except of course his translation, is inaccurate. So Sitchin's makes the bold claim when he writes, the prime source for the biblical verse quoted in the 12th Planet is the Old Testament in its original Hebrew text. It must be bore in mind that all the translations consulted, of which the principal ones are listed at the end of the book, are just that, translations or interpretations. In the final analysis, what counts is what the original Hebrew says. So this is misleading because original Hebrew is not a mystical, whimsical, cryptic language that cannot be translated straight into English, right? And yes, some words can have multiple meanings in different contexts, but it's not impossible to decipher accurately and to translate a point across languages, right? There are people who speak original Hebrew that also speak English and accurately can convey what a Hebrew text says. Multiple translations of the Bible exist primarily for money reasons, right? Publisher copyright reasons, and poetic reasons as well, right? So, but if you're interested to learn about why there are multiple biblical translations, definitely just give my episode a listen titled "What is the Bible? How was the Bible made?" where I kind of break it down into detail. So now getting back onto the topic here, Sitchin goes on to start making these grand claims of similarities between the ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian cultures, inevitably just obscurely tying it into the Old Testament stories. One of the first ones being this statement that he makes here. Yet all was not that simple in spite of the assumed foreign origin of these invaders. The Old Testament treated them as part and parcel of biblical events. Cyrus, for example, was considered to be an anointed of Yahweh. Quite an unusual relationship between the Hebrew God and a non-Hebrew. According to the biblical book of Ezra, Cyrus acknowledged his mission to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and stated that he was acting upon orders given by Yahweh, who he called God of heaven. So now the reason he makes this claim in the book, right, obviously, is he's trying to say that the Assyrians and the Hebrew Israelites of the time were one and the same, worshiping the same God. However, what he fails to acknowledge or tell you is the reason Yahweh used Cyrus was actually to fulfill a 150-year-old prophecy made in the book of Isaiah, where God said he would use someone in the future, a king of the Assyrians, specifically, in this case, Cyrus, to free his people, Israel, after they had turned away from God and he withdrew his hand from them. What also went over Sitchin's head is that Yahweh, God the Father, throughout the Old Testament, has used people who are not Jewish, not Hebrews, not Israelites, to fulfill his prophecies, because anyone who followed the Abrahamic faith of Abraham was considered a son of God. Even in the Old Testament, God would extend his promise of salvation and blessing to all those who loved and followed his laws. It's not a secret. You know, the passage Sitchin cites actually affirms God's promise in the Old Testament to free his people from their oppressors. God foretold this event 150 years ago before it happened, through his prophet Isaiah, showing his sovereignty over all things. What he's trying to say and again, I know, I'm giving you guys an excerpt from right in a book, and I'm trying to fill in the context as best I can for you, without, just droning on with a bunch of details that are irrelevant. But very early in the book, he starts to build this idea that the Nephilim gods who came to or aliens, I should say, who came to the earth were worshipped as gods. Partial truth in that and a partial biblical parallel, but he just deviates from it because now he just tries to say that all these cultures worship the same God, which is not true. I mean, and historically that's confirmed. Like, not every culture worship the same God, right? And like I said, in his attempt here to try to paint this picture with a biblical verse, he fails to realize that what he is quoting here was something promised by God hundreds of years before the event took place, and it was written by Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, and it's in the book, and you can read it. The passage, and this is just, again, Sitchin's trying to establish an historical document like the Bible, because it is a collection of writings and documents, and he does that to add legitimacy to his claims, and then tries to deconstruct the legitimacy at the same time. It's kind of a paradox, really. But anyway, he continues on then to write, Layard had read in ancient Greek records that an officer in Alexander's army saw a place of pyramids and remains of an ancient city, a city that was already buried in Alexander's time. Layard dug it up too, and it turned out to be Nimrud, Assyria's military center. It was there that Shalmaneser II set up an obelisk to record his military expeditions and conquests. Now on exhibit at the British Museum, the obelisk lists among the kings who were made to pay tribute Jehu, son of Omri, king of Israel again. The Mesopotamian inscriptions and biblical texts support each other. Astounded by increasingly frequent corroboration of the biblical narrative by archaeological finds, the Assyriologists, as these scholars came to be called, turn to the 10th chapter of the book of Genesis. There, Nimrod, a mighty hunter by the grace of Yahweh, was described as the founder of all the kingdoms of Mesopotamia. So again, just like with the previous excerpt I had read, he's just affirming what is already known, that the Old Testament is a historical document, and it recorded the conquest of the Israelites, it recorded the conquest of their enemies, and it recorded other cultures pre the first book of the Old Testament being Genesis. And this is something that the Bible talks about. There were cultures that predated the creation of the Old Testament. It's not a secret, but unfortunately, people are not aware of this. So when you have guys like Sitchins come along and make these grand claims of mystery and secrecy, it sounds mystical and inviting, and unfortunately, people will turn away from sound doctrine and follow on to these myths. And again, part of the reason I'm doing this episode is part of a theme here on the podcast, if you haven't seen it yet, which is just breaking down these popular doctrinal beliefs of whatever it may be, ancient aliens, other religions, or cults, and what have you, to really show you that that biblically people put the Bible and the history of Christ under such scrutiny. But things like this, they'll hear it, like the Annunaki, ancient aliens, they'll hear it one time and take it as gospel, the wrong gospel. So don't let these things like this, when you hear it, move you away from that true path of salvation, which is Christ. Now, in the book, if you do read it, you will start to see, and this is again affirmed by some of these scholars that I quoted in the beginning of the episode, Sitchin's just blatantly makes up Sumerian words that he claims turn into modern recognized technologies, right? For instance, like rocket ships, missiles, space suits, things like that. But again, none of this is actually grounded in factual translations of the text, and this is an important detail for the next passage that I'm going to get into right here. Having done as Abraham had requested, two of the angels, the third man turned out to be the Lord himself, then proceeded to Sodom. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, was sitting at the gate of Sodom. And when he saw them, he rose up to meet them and bowed to the ground and said, "If it pleases my lords, pray come to the house of thy servant and wash your feet and sleep overnight." Then he made for them a feast, and they ate. When the news of the arrival of the two spread in town, all the townspeople, young and old, surrounded the house and called out to Lot and said, "Where are the men who came this night unto thee? How were these men who ate, drank, slept, and washed their tired feet? Nevertheless, so instantly recognizable as angels of the Lord." The only plausible explanation is that what they wore, their helmets or uniforms or whatever they carried, their weapons, made them immediately recognizable. Okay, so your head might be spinning here for a second. So what Sitchins is quoting vaguely, and by vague I mean he's not including the full story, right, is Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot, right? The rescue of Lot by God. The Lord sent the angels to rescue Lot from Sodom because it was going to be razed to the ground. So to my previous point, to make up nonsensical words to describe, modern weaponry, spacesuits, and all this stuff, right? He continues to just use biblical stories to try to justify his false translation. And that's really what they are. To his point of saying, well, how did the people in the town know that these were angels of the Lord? Well, first off, the townspeople didn't know they were angels of the Lord. Only Lot did, because God spoke to Abraham, and the narrator was saying that they were angels of the Lord, and Lot knew them to be angels of the Lord because he was a righteous man. He was actually the only righteous man in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he followed in the footsteps of Abraham, who worshiped Yahweh, right? God the Father. And just like all towns at that time, there was usually one main gate that everybody passed through, and the towns and the cities were small, so anybody passing through these gates would be seen by the people, who would then tell other people that, hey, there are strangers here. If you actually go and read the biblical story, the townspeople simply say, "Who were the men that were in your house or that came to your house?" They didn't know that they were angels. Sodom and Gomorrah was exceedingly sinful, and the reason the people surrounded Lot's house was because they wanted to sexually abuse the men. They didn't know that they were angels. So Sitchin's point here is completely wrong, and again, it goes with many of these authors who love to use the Bible as an anchor for their theories. but it's completely fabricated translation and omitting biblical context to justify his theories of these ancient aliens. And just one thing to note, too, for anybody who believes that the Annunaki were ancient space aliens, even before you kind of read his work and break this down, you'd have to explain then, how can these aliens create these super civilized civilizations with such advanced knowledge and genetics and engineering? They could build rockets and all sorts of flying machines to get from planet Nibiru to Earth. But then the best record keeping they can do was with rocks, and with such poorly detailed engravings that any image depicted by the author in his book, in Sitchin's book, is debatable. And then you would have to explain how the same super advanced alien race then supposedly had technology to make humans and seed the Earth, but couldn't stay on the Earth and has to go back and forth to their planet that's just floating somewhere in space and is only close to the Earth every couple of thousand years. So that way, when the gap between the distance of the planet Nibiru and Earth closes, then they can come over here. And not for nothing, and I don't mean to laugh or belittle somebody's belief if you believe in this, but comparatively to, let's say, Christian history, church history, the Bible, sure. There's many disagreements over the supernatural aspects. Completely understand, right? It sounds fantastical. I get it. But if you objectively look at the history of Christ, how he was documented throughout antiquity by different authors, Christian and non-Christian, but also the history of the church and even where the biblical writings come from, they stand to the most critical scrutiny at the very axiom of Christianity. It can be historically proven that the events in the Old Testament happened. Jesus Christ was a real person, and the church existed since the first century, and those are historical facts. Unlike something like this, which is completely based on a literal lie, I mean, there's no other way to say it, because like I said in the beginning of this podcast, Sitchins is completely making up words and had no professional education to be able to translate this, but claims he does. And now there's whole History Channel episodes about it, So anyway, I'm trying to keep this episode short. The last excerpt from the book I want to share with you is here. A Keperith, also made of gold, was to be placed above the chest and held up by two cherubim cast of solid gold. The nature of Keperith, meaning scholars speculate covering, is not clear, but this verse from Exodus suggests its purpose. And I will address thee from above the Keperith, from between the two cherubim. The implications of that Ark of the Covenant was principally a communications box, electrically operated as enhanced by the instructions concerning its portability. It was to be carried by means of wooden staffs passed through 4 golden rings. No one was to touch the chest proper, and when one Israelite did touch it, he was killed instantly, as if by a charge of high voltage electricity. So Sitchins, in that passage, is claiming that the Ark of the Covenant was some kind of communications relay to talk to other Nephilim aliens in space. Again, saying that the reason nobody could touch it was because it was too electrically potent, but completely ignored what the Bible said, which is the Ark was meant to be the mercy seat of God, because God, Yahweh, wants to dwell among his people, but they're sinful, and he can't stand to be in the presence of sin. So the Ark of the Covenant, being his mercy seat, is pure and cannot be touched by unclean hands, and he would talk to people from above the mercy seat. So anyway, like I said in the beginning of the podcast, this is a long book. It's an interesting read. I recommend you give it a read, but definitely read it with a grain of salt, knowing knowing Sitchin's background. And again, the reason I did this episode, and I do a lot of these episodes, is just to show people the disparaging amount of criticism between, let's say, the biblical narrative and then everything else out there that people use to justify why they're not Christians, or why Christianity is false or fabricated. And if you are a Christian who has heard about the ancient aliens thing before and kind of maybe accepted it, disregarded it, whatever, I do this just to prove to you it is a complete fabrication. Unfortunately, we're in a day and age where people don't really care about what is true, but what's more entertaining. And it is a great story. I read the book. It's very interesting, but it's a story. And unfortunately, it is permeated into mainstream culture. And we've all seen Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, like I said earlier, and things like that. But it's based on a man's imagination. And anyway, I know I only gave 3 examples here. Like I said, I'm trying to keep the episodes a little shorter without droning on. Like I said, if you want to read the book, most of the material of the book, it's hard to really present here because of the massive amount of like context and information he writes about leading up to it. Most of the book is really this, where he is just pulling these random scriptures out of the Bible and then trying to parallel them with his supposed translations. And then, of course, his book, and unfortunately, I couldn't pull it, but he also has a bunch of visual depictions of the Sumerian, not hieroglyphs, but the Sumerian artwork, where he claims it's people using, or the aliens, right, using spaceships, using diving gear, things like that, and I look, and they're in the book. He does show you the pictures, and they're not secret. Like, you can go to Google and pull them up and see what they really are. Like, for instance, there is one that he presents as being the assembly of gods under the night sky, using like rocket ships and standing by their spaceships. The real depiction of it, and this is from like some of these scholars I was telling you about in the early beginnings, it is a hunting scene, and it's just things like that. So it's hard for me to really present that here in mass because, again, the episode would just be totally wildly long. And like I said, I want to give you guys the highlights, give you an idea of what's going on. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But anyway, I digress. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, I try to keep it short, keep it impactful. I try my best not to ramble. So not much to say in closing on this one other than the usuals. If you enjoy the podcast, just please like and subscribe and check out some of the other platforms. I hope you guys got something out of this. If you have any comments, concerns, feel free to drop comments below or shoot me an email at justifiedbelief@gmail.com. God bless you all, and I'll see you at the next episode.